Then you get into the 1970s, global population has grown to 4 billion. So, you know, our numbers are burgeoning quite nicely. And that takes us into the 80s. And again, Simon talked about this. This is getting some of the ice cores, you know, where we're analysing the gas bubbles that were in them in order to give us an idea of how the concentration of gases like carbon dioxide had fluctuated in the atmosphere over the preceding years. And these Vostok ice cores are some of the first evidence which made us realise that there was really something quite dramatic happening now, and we could benchmark it against the previous levels of carbon dioxide as the Earth had gone in and out of ice ages. And it was this evidence that led the United Nations 20 years ago to set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So again, the alarm bells are ringing 20 years ago in quite a concerned way now. Then we come into the 90s, and you know, we've grown to about 5.26 billion, 5.25 billion people. And the really kind of the foundation stone of where we are now on climate change and wider environmental engagement was the 92 Rio Earth Summit. And it makes me feel like a right old git that I can, you know, hark back and remember this very clearly as a real kind of line in the sand. And out of Rio came the Kyoto Protocol, which again was the first kind of international legislative regulatory agreement on collectively tackling carbon emissions. And it didn't go anywhere near far enough. Its ambitions were modest, but it was a battle to fight these kind of reductions through, even then. And that brings us to roughly where we are at now, about 6.5 billion people on the planet. Now, just to kind of reinforce the notion of that rapid growth, there are actually more people alive today than have ever lived. Now, that sounds counterintuitive, but if you think about the speed of the ascent of that graph of population, it's a bit like the speed of the ascent of the graph that Simon was showing us earlier on the rise in carbon dioxide levels. Basically, our global population fluctuated along at a very, very low level for a very long time, right since the moment when we climbed down from the trees somewhere in Africa. And if you like, what's then happened, it took us a very long time to get to 1.5 billion at the turn of the 20th century. Then, in just 100 years, we quadrupled. If you think about that as a graph, the number of people under that graph is vastly bigger than the people under the line that took us to get there. So there's more people alive now than have ever lived. And it's our consumption and our massive consumption of material resources, and in particular the use of fossil fuels, which has driven this change. So it's quite a shocking alignment of population growth and burning of fossil fuels, which has led us to where we are now. And if you like, everyone talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. To paraphrase Mark Twain. And this is our challenge, if you like, is trying to get people to take action. And we have a pathway. The UK is unique in having a climate change bill anywhere in the world, which commits us to a legally binding 80% carbon emissions reduction by 2050. And it's quite a staggering piece of legislation in terms of the scale of its ambition. Unfortunately, what it does is it presents such a long timescale that it allows politicians to constantly push the responsibility for taking the really radical action into the future. You know, so whilst it's great to have it, it's still an easy excuse to say, oh, we'll get round to doing that tomorrow, next week, in the next administration. And if you look at the atmosphere, and you look at it in terms of the relative scale of the atmosphere to the whole planet, if you rolled it up into a ball, that's how big it is compared to the size of the whole Earth. So it's actually an enormously vulnerable little ball of gases. If you like, it's like the skin on the onion. And we are actually radically changing the composition of the atmosphere. And as we saw from the graphs that Simon was putting up, you know, this is what's causing us so much dramatic concern. So what are we being encouraged to do? Well, people say, oh, we can offset, we can do carbon offsetting, we can plant trees, or we can invest in renewable energy projects around the world. And I love this particular website, Cheap Neutral, because I think this kind of reveals the offsetting industry for what it is, which is kind of like get out of climate change jail free, i.e. you can carry on doing exactly what you've always done as long as you offset. And what Cheap Neutral says is that if you want to be unfaithful to your partner, that's absolutely fine, because if you pay them some money, they'll invest in people who remain faithful and loyal to their partners. So thereby absolving you of all guilt for your infidelity. And so it's kind of, it's taking a satirical take on, you know, the notion of getting out of climate change jail free as a result of offsetting. And we touched on this earlier, but the notion of financial incentives to get us to change our behaviour also needs to be brought into question. And if you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend this book, Freakonomics, because it's a kind of a lateral take on the things that we assume to be true, which in practice turn out not to be. And there's a wonderful example in here of an American kindergarten where they had a real problem with parents turning up late to pick up their children from school. And so in order to disincentivise this particular behaviour, they decided to introduce a fine to say, OK, if you turn up late to pick up your child from school, we're going to fine you. And what happened? When they brought in the fine, parents turned up later, more frequently, to pick up their kids, because they'd been absolved of the responsibility of doing so, because they could pay the fine and get away with it. And so it actually, instead of having the intended effect, it had exactly the opposite effect. So I think we have to get quite wary about financial incentives. And the real challenge, if you like, is that whilst we've come a long way in terms of awareness on climate change, is we need to use the creative cultural approach to try and drive this towards the real tangible behaviour change that we need. And we're going to need to be flexible and basically pull our heads out of our own arses, because we need to ask ourselves some difficult questions about what we are doing and how we are going to get out of this particular mess that we've backed ourselves into. Because at the minute, and the government's example of the Heathrow third runway is a classic example of this. It's like we're like the White Queen in Alice in Wonderland, where we're prepared to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. So whilst the climate change bill says we will reduce carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, we're still prepared to build a third runway and expand aviation. So we're going to be growing carbon emissions in one sector of the economy, even though we're supposed to be reducing them right across the board. And it kind of pulls us in 2 different directions at the same time. And there's clearly a problem in doing this, and we need to actually kind of get our heads around the kind of resources and the opportunities we're squandering at the moment. And this comes back to my point around creating a vision of a positive future that we might be heading towards. And I think decisions like Heathrow third runway are made very much in the context of the now, rather than with an eye on the longer term. So how have the creative industries engaged in this challenge to date? And again, Simon touched on the film The Day After Tomorrow. This is a slightly more abstract photo from it. And what The Day After Tomorrow did very well was represent the politics of climate change negotiation. Okay, the science was a bit barking and a bit radical. But this kind of obfuscation and foot dragging and the slowness of the approach was actually very well represented in this film, and the kind of horse trading that's going on. And we're going to see a lot more of that this year. And perhaps one of the most interesting challenges to address creatively in 2009 is the run-up to the next phase of Kyoto, if you like, the Copenhagen negotiations, where we're going to try and have, the son or daughter of Kyoto agreed. And it's really intriguing what's going to happen in terms of the public support for the type of things that politicians are going to be doing, because public awareness in Kyoto over 10 years ago was still very poor. And I think there's been a Damascene shift since then.